Hello and welcome to episode 1 of Fake Fangs. This episode is called Creepy Paper, and today I will be talking about the first ever episode of FX's What We Do in the Shadows. I'm very excited for the first official episode of this podcast, and I hope you guys are excited to listen, so let's get into it. Straight off the bat, we start with Guillermo, who looks so cute and quite awkward as he's addressing us, the audience, and he's drawing us straight into this world of vampires, and I feel like it's a direct follow-on from the movie where Viago greeted us to begin with. It's as if the movie has ended and one of the characters was like, okay, let's go to Staten Island, and then it just cuts to that shot of Guillermo, and it all just feels very linear, which I think can be difficult to do, especially when the movie came out in 2014. So there was a 5-year gap between these two things being made. And the movie being what it is, a movie, sometimes things do have to change to adapt better to the small screen. The episodes are a lot shorter, whereas the movie is over an hour long, so you would expect there to be some differences, especially since it's a completely new setting, there's a completely new cast of characters. But the great thing about it is that they've managed to keep it the same. You can just tell from the energy of the first episode that everything from the movie that was so charming and entertaining has made it into a completely seamless transition. And if I'm not wrong, I believe Taika directed this episode and Jermaine wrote it as well. So it makes sense that it's so close to the source material because it's their source material. So of course they're able to pull directly from that. Another interesting thing that I really like as well is when Nandor rises up from his coffin, and that's our first meeting with his character, which is the exact same way that we met Viago in the movie. And I believe in an interview with Kayvan Novak, who plays Nandor, he discussed how he thinks his character is so similar to Viago's, which you can just see straight away. If him rising from his coffin didn't give it away immediately, you can see, mainly throughout season 1, how much of Viago there is in Nandor, which is such a great starting point for him as it brings a familiarity to his character, and it feels like we're not on such a major starting point with him, and that maybe we already know a little bit about him and his personality and who he is as a character, so we're comfortable with him, but there's still enough that we don't know about him that intrigues us. Personally, for me, I think what intrigued me the most was his interactions with Guillermo and the introduction of vampires having familiars. Okay, so this brings me on to the full introduction we see of Nandor and Guillermo together. Instantly, it's clear to us that they are a pair, and what a weird combination they are. I find the way that they bounce off each other is just so appealing to me. It's so odd, and it feels like it shouldn't work, but it just does, and they're so attuned to each other. And then we learned that Guillermo has been there for 10 years, and wow, the commitment. I don't think I've ever committed to anything for even 5 years, let alone 10. So just by learning that, we instantly gained the understanding that, they're just super comfortable with each other and the roles that they play in each other's lives. They're obviously trying to maintain this professional relationship because, Guillermo is serving Nandor almost like a butler, but the work that he does do is far more personal, and therefore boundaries are constantly crossing, so it seems like they're just trying their best at playing professional, but it doesn't always work out for them, which we see in later seasons, which we will definitely get into in later episodes. For now, let's talk about the way we see Guillermo talking to Nandor through the coffin, and Nandor can't get the coffin open, and Guillermo can't get the coffin open, and it's just not working for them. Guillermo prefaces Nandor's introduction with this big talk of, it's a super dangerous job, and he goes through these dramatics of lighting all these candles, only for the interaction to be just so awkward. The tone is set. We instantly learn that everyone in this show is just so stupid, but it feels realistic, Nothing is overly dramatic or glamorized, and I feel like it just sets it apart from other types of vampire media. I'm really happy somebody came up with this kind of subgenre of vampires where vampires are just normal people. For so long, they've been completely theatrical and over-dramatized, and it's easy to forget that they're just normal people who happen to be immortal and drink blood. Sure, they may be hundreds, if not thousands of years old and don't quite understand the modern world, but I feel like in this show, they're not really that far removed from humans. So many vampire shows and movies talk about how they want to fit in with society. If we just take Twilight as a quick example, the Cullens want to blend in as much as possible so no one discovers their secret, which seems to be a running theme for this kind of genre. But then I feel like the movies go ahead and they just contrast that fact immediately by setting the vampires apart from humans and then making them so much higher up the food chain. I feel like this show, it's so refreshing to have them act in the same awkward ways as humans. It's such an unparalleled idea within vampire media, and you just feel like you're getting such a unique experience with these ancient vampires in a modern setting. Speaking of ancient vampires in a modern setting, this is leading me on to the supermarket scene with Nandor and Guillermo. Firstly, it needs to be said, I think Nandor's outfit is so pretty in this scene. Is his cape ridiculous? Yes, but there's something slightly different about his clothing in this episode in comparison to the rest of the show. What he wears here seems to be more gothic, whereas in later episodes they lean more into the Persian style for him to better represent his heritage. This black outfit with the gold edges on the cape and the lacy cuff sleeves, even just the style of his tunic, suits him in such a pretty way. I think this is the only time we see him in this kind of style, so I definitely think it's worth pointing out. Overall, I think the outfits are one of the main things I focus on in this scene. Again, Nandor is in his all black outfit. He has this completely impractical long cape that drags on the floor, and the bright fluorescent lights in the supermarket and the brighter colours of the products contrast the dark outfit, which makes him stick out like such a sore thumb. If we compare that to the dark setting of the mansion where he fits in perfectly, it makes him seem like he's stuck in time. I mean, he's this 700-year-old vampire shopping for glitter and crepe paper. It's just such a ridiculous thought, and it's really highlighted by just his clothing. If we compare that to Guillermo, who's wearing this tan beige jacket, and he just really sinks into the background, you know, he just blends in with the rest of the store. I really feel like that's everything that you need to know about him right there as a familiar. None of these vampires really want him to stand out, and when we see him in the house, he's wearing these sort of dark and drab jumpers, and the colours just seem to blend in, which I think says that he's managed to at least find his place within the household, but again, he's camouflaged and he's barely bringing attention to himself, which I think overall there's such a subtle commentary coming from each character's wardrobe throughout the show, which we will touch upon again later. But for the supermarket scene, we get a nice introduction into the world of Nandor and Guillermo's relationship with each other, and we learn from the get-go that it is not a good one. Guillermo is very clearly just treated so badly and with complete disregard, which we'll get into that in just a moment, but something really interesting that I think should be mentioned is the way that the treatment of Guillermo by Nandor and the other vampires is introduced to us in a funny way. We're being told that Guillermo is a bit annoying, a bit awkward, a bit pathetic, and can get in the way of things. But there's something that's just stopping me from really being on the vampire's side and agreeing with their views of him. I think it comes from the way that he connects with the audience. He's the first one to address us and talk to us. We also have quite a lot of one-to-one interviews with him. I know we have with the vampires too, but it seems as if he takes the time to talk to the audience, to explain about the vampire world, or just to check in and let us know what's happening. The main thing that I've really noticed is how he looks into the camera so often. With the vampires, it feels like we're just onlookers and we're watching things as they happen. But because Guillermo engages us so often, it's as if we're spending time with him. And personally, for me, I just feel more present and absorbed in the moments when he does connect with us. He's the only human in the house, so I feel that him making that direct connection with the audience is very deliberate, and it's purposely engaging us as humans who can sympathise with him and the situation that he has to be in. Although we aren't familiars ourselves, every time he does give a knowing or sarcastic glance our way, it's just as if to say, hey, can you believe this right now? Which gains our sympathy because for a brief moment we can imagine what it would be like to have to deal with the same things. So I feel like we get this connection with him that we don't have with the other characters. Continuing with our talk of Guillermo and his role as familiar, if I'm right in remembering, I don't think there was any mention of familiars in the movie. I think this is possibly an idea that was created for the purpose of the show, and although familiars are more of a witch's thing, I feel like it makes so much sense for vampires to have that also because, yeah, they are going to need someone who can run around and do things for them during the day that they can't do for themselves. And yeah, they'll need someone to explain the ways of the modern world and modern technology. So the concept of a familiar seems to fit really well within the world of vampires. But then we learn that for being a familiar and serving their masters, they are to be gifted with vampirism after their servitude. Immediately, yes, it makes so much sense, and I think it made me relate to Guillermo so much more and have this understanding as to why he puts up with so much crap from everyone. But the way they treat him makes me wonder, is vampirism even worth it? He seems to be sticking with it and putting in so much dedication, even after all the years he's already served there, but he's excluded and he's shown that he's lower than them and that they think so little of him, with Nandor constantly telling him, vampire only this and vampire only that, even if he tries to do more than even breathe. Nandor is trying so hard to keep him at arm's length and keep this divide between them to show Guillermo that he's just not one of them and he is not on the same level. It's so difficult to see how Guillermo looks so sad, but also unbothered about it at the same time. Like, he's just used to this whole ordeal, and just from these small exchanges, we get such an understanding of who he is as a character. He's motivated to get what he wants out of his and Nandor's deal, but in the process, it's made him a little pathetic, since he's allowed himself to be treated so badly for so many years, with what seems from Nandor no actual compliance to keep his end of the deal. As Nandor is someone who is such a stickler for the rules, which we see when he's trying to entice Nadja and Laszlo into the fancy room to read the letter from Baron Afanas, but he doesn't seem to care about sticking to the rules of their deal that he agreed to, which just shows how much disregard he has for the care of Guillermo. I mean, they shove the poor guy in the tiniest storage room in the house. He really is living his Harry Potter moment, but again, it just seems like he's okay with this. He's made himself nice and cozy under there, and he doesn't even have a proper door. And then he goes on to show us Antonio Banderas playing Armand in The Interview with the Vampire, and I love that movie, so I start to relate to him again, and I just get it, you know, he loves vampire stuff. He's happy to see himself be represented, which has given him this obsession with it all. It's so easy to get swept up in your interests, especially because if my math checks out, I think he was around 18 or 19 when Nandor first recruited him to be his familiar. If I was his age, completely obsessed with vampires, and this tall, dark, handsome vampire guy came to me and made a promise to make me a vampire, I absolutely would have accepted as well. Guillermo literally says, if Armand can do it, so can I. And he's this young, impressionable kid, nothing if not consistent for keeping at it for 10 years, even if his hopes of their deal playing out like it should are not turning out like he'd hoped. Nandor can't even remember that he's been serving him for 10 years. He thinks he's been there for 2 years, and then Guillermo tells him that it's been 10, and he's just not even fazed. He just goes to sleep. Nandor just doesn't even care to remember all the things that Guillermo has done for him, and it just shows how indifferent Nandor is, which is then emphasized by the treatment of June, Nadja and Laszlo's familiar, and how neither of them do anything to stop her from being eaten by the Baron, and they barely notice that she's gone afterwards. Although, we do get a little juicy moment with Guillermo at the end of the episode when he's holding the curtain open against Nandor's coffin. So there is some resistance, there is some fight in him, even though he puts up with all the crap. From that one scene, you can see just how much resentment that he has for Nandor. The amount of things that were shown just in this one episode speaks absolute volumes between them. It's so exciting. It's one of the main reasons I wanted to keep watching this show, so I could see how this dynamic develops between them. Okay, so moving on to Nadja and Laszlo. They just appear looking so gorgeous and beautiful, and I think the first time I ever watched it, I got so stupidly excited to see that Matt Berry was in this show. I saw him in The IT Crowd and Toast of London, and I think anyone who's seen him in a show can agree that he is just fantastic. He's so hilarious, but in the shows I've seen him in, he plays a sort of everyday man kind of role. It made me so intrigued to see what he would do with this character. They're two completely different things, you know, a normal man and then a vampire from the 1700s. And Matt Berry himself acts in a very unique way, which has been perfect for all the other characters I've seen him play. And I think this really emphasizes my point from earlier that these vampires are so much like normal humans who then just also happen to be vampires. Matt Berry just seems to completely fit the role of Laszlo in a way that isn't too dissimilar from the roles that he's done before. But then there's also such a unique quality to Laszlo as well that I can't really seem to put my finger on. He just seems to be so real to the point where sometimes if I see Matt Berry in an interview, it's kind of jarring to see him not acting like Laszlo. From the very beginning, he's really putting his all into it, and it's kept his character so consistent throughout. And I think just from this, it's really put Laszlo as such a fan favourite. Speaking of favourites, we get introduced to Nadja, who is just so beautiful. It's brilliant to see a woman in this show, and as much as I love the movies, I really wanted to see a main female vampire character in this kind of world, and they did not disappoint. I adore her with every fibre of my being. I just love seeing her in any scene and the way that she interacts with the other characters. Of course, it absolutely has to be mentioned that her costumes are the most fantastic and they just always look amazing. I believe there was an interview with the show's costume designer, who was also the costume designer for the movie as well. She was talking about how exciting it was to design these stunning, gothic, vampiric female costumes, since the movie itself was obviously very male-centric. Her excitement for designing them is just so evident because they are just absolutely gorgeous. Paired with Laszlo's matching outfits, again, the commentary from the costumes alone just tells such a story. It's like Nadja and Laszlo are this one single entity. They've been with each other for over 300 years, and it speaks volumes of how much they must know each other and understand each other, and also the fact that we learn straight away that Nadja is Laszlo's sire. Laszlo's telling the story like he's proud to be telling us, and then the look that we get from Nadja, and she's just so happy with herself. It's so cute. They're so obsessed with each other. And then it's interesting to see them both mention the Baron, how it's revealed to us that they both had a sexual affair with him. Neither of them are fazed by it. Neither of them believe that the other is cheated. It's just this casual mention that they're in this open marriage with each other, which to me is a pretty amusing dynamic, but also one that we don't really get to see being represented very often. There needs to be so much trust and understanding between them both for them to be so unfazed when the other mentions having any kind of affair with another person. I think it's the main thing that really interested me about their characters. Then we also get the first mention of Gregor as well. So this isn't a new development between them. It's obviously what their relationship has been throughout their lifetime together. Also, Laszlo being open about his sexual affair with the Baron, just a casual mention there that Laszlo is queer in some kind of way. It's just so interesting. I really enjoy the representation that we get from them both, but also that it's not made such a big deal out of. It's just these humorous, offhand comments, and then we just move on. So I really like this situation, and I know many other people who watch the show as well appreciate it just as much as I do. And just the way that this type of representation is handled, it feels like we're in safe hands. It seems unlikely that these characters will suddenly be forced to be straight, since their queerness is written so deep into who they are as a character. Last, but certainly not least, we get introduced to Colin Robinson. My God, I just love him. Who came up with the idea of an energy vampire? What an incredible idea. I cannot tell you how much I laughed when I first met him. He's so intriguing. We learned straight away that energy vampires are the most common kind of vampires. They're daywalkers and they can drain other vampires of their energy. But how? Why? There's so many questions I have about how they can even exist. And I think with every new thing that we learn about him, so many questions come to mind for me. I just want to know so much more about him. Again, just mentioning the costumes here for Colin Robinson, who wears quite a lot of grey and light beige clothing. When he's in his office, he fits right in. He's trying to blend in at his workplace and live among the people he's feeding from and stay disguised as a normal human so that he can feed as and when he needs to in peace. But as soon as he gets back to the house, his clothing sticks out. It's modern like Guillermo's, which sets him apart from the other vampires. The colours are similar to what Guillermo wears, with Guillermo's beige outfits and white shirts underneath his jumpers, which I think creates this minimal link between them in that they are people who are suited for the modern world. But I think the similarities end there because then, unlike Guillermo, Colin Robinson's clothing is just so loud and bright in this dark, dingy setting of the house. He sticks out in a way that makes him seen and present in the room. It's hard to ignore him when he's there, and that's what he clearly wants when he's around the other vampires. He tries to blend in at the office and feed unnoticed, but then at the house, part of his feeding is his presence in the vampires' lives. Even just by being in the room, every fibre of his being seems to be trying to frustrate and annoy the others. I just think that's what's so comical about him. It will always be amusing to me that when we first see all the vampires together in a group, it's just Nadja rolling her eyes at the boys who are having their little spat. As I said before, Nandor is immediately shown to us as this guy who likes sticking to the rules and he likes things done a certain way, and Laszlo comes in to challenge that immediately. I remember watching this really interesting video where a relationship therapist was analysing the scene of Nandor wanting to read the letter in the fancy room, and they were telling us that Nandor was doing a good job at explaining his wants and gently trying to get the others to comply with him and his formalities. It seems from this reaction that Nandor is usually the one who calls these types of meetings to keep the household running and to keep this kind of harmony between them all, which is then just completely overshadowed by the fact that Nandor then starts to argue with Laszlo about keeping half-drunk victims in the house. You know, there's bound to be tensions if they've lived together as roommates for such a long time, but it all just seems to play off as such a normal interaction. Again, another callback to my point of these vampires just being as human as the rest of us. The hilarity really comes from these situations we see them in, then paired with the supernatural elements of them hissing at each other through their fangs, or the scene where we see both Nandor and Laszlo fighting with each other, but they're flying around the foyer while they're doing it, and it just seems that we're witnessing something so surreal and absurd, yet it's also just a casual daily occurrence for them. Having Nadja not saying anything while they're having their little argument, only to hiss at them once to shut them both up and then calmly suggest her solution, is such a power move. Almost as if they both realise that their argument is silly, but they've committed to making their point, and having Nadja then stepping in as a mediator, although stupid, just seems to work. It's a dynamic that is unorthodox, but has worked for them to live in harmony for so many years. We're coming towards the end of the first episode, so just some ending notes that I want to make. Something I noticed is that there are some subtle differences in how they style the cast in comparison to episode 2. I feel like Laszlo's beard is definitely the most noticeable difference, as we see it as more of a goatee. And then in the second episode, his beard is a lot fuller and covers most of his face. Also, the layout of Colin Robinson's office is definitely different to episode 2. Then, as we've mentioned, Nandor's styling is also different. He's very gothic here, and his hair is also a bit shorter and more wavy than what we see it later on. But the main thing of note is his accent isn't as refined to how we hear him speak in later episodes. In an interview with Kayvan, he mentioned that he first thought of the accent 15 years prior to the show, when he was doing the accent for another character he created for Phonejacker. You can tell that although he changed the accent to suit Nandor's character, there are still elements in there of a different character. But I think as the show goes on, this gets a lot more polished and the accent does become completely different to how we hear it in the first episode. So there's just a couple of things I noticed. It makes me think, was there a gap between filming the first episode and the second? If so, why? I'm always so curious about what happens behind the scenes. It makes me wonder if there was a reason behind the changes. And finally, I just want to comment on the vampire's different powers. So we know that Nadja is a good crawler, and we know that Laszlo has super strong mind control. We also know that Nandor can turn into a vapor, but I think this is possibly the only time that we see Nandor use his ability of pyrokinesis. I mean, what an amazing power to have, and then we never get to see it used again. It makes me think, is this something that they decided to change between episode 1 and 2 as well? Did they revoke Nandor's fire powers, or will we ever get to see him use them again? I personally would love to see the vampires use their abilities more in the show. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed listening to this as much as I enjoyed talking about FX's What We Do in the Shadows. If you liked this podcast, then please give me a follow on Instagram at fakefangs_ for more content. And thank you so much to my editor, Becky Gray, who you can also find on Instagram at Becky Gray Music Art. I hope you guys have a lovely day with whatever it is you're doing, and I will see you next time. Bye!